A blessed and good morning to everyone this morning. It's so good to have you guys back. We're glad you're able to make it this morning. And we are continuing all of our lessons out of the book of James about practical Christianity. And our lesson this morning is on do not live worldly. Our key verse, which some can probably quote, is found in James chapter 4, verse 7, which says, "Submit yourself therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." And that's one of the mistakes that some people make, is they try to resist him before submitting to God first. And if I were to ask you, what is worldly behavior? Some of the answers people might come back with would be specific immoral acts, such as drunkenness, adultery, pornography. But in the book of James, we see that worldly living is not defined simply by an immoral activity or an immoral action. Worldly living can take place in many different ways that people might not imagine would constitute living in a conflict with God's word. And so that's what today's lesson is the biblical definition of worldliness and avoiding it. So to start our lesson this morning, we are starting out in James chapter 4. And we'll read verses 1 through 3 to start. It says, "From whence come wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence even of your lusts that war in your members? You lust and you have not, you kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you have not, because you ask not. You ask and receive not, because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts." And I dare say that everyone, when they were children, and even maybe some as adults, fight or argue with their siblings over issues that really, in the grand scheme of things, were no big deal and are no big deal. But there was always a specific reason behind that arguing or fighting. And so James here begins his discussion on worldly living by asking a somewhat rhetorical question to get to the root. And he asked his readers why they were prone to fight and to argue. And James explained, that we just read, and we noticed this today, that when people feel dissatisfied with their own lives, that's when they pick fights with others in an attempt to obtain what they think will bring them satisfaction. How many know that if you're internally dissatisfied, that's going to lead to an outward manifestation? In other words, if people are internally dissatisfied with themselves, they're going to figure a way to pick fights or get in conflicts with others to try to make themselves feel better or make themselves look better. We see that a lot with people where if they have self-esteem issues, they're going to try to pick other people out, to belittle, to make fun of, to, try to lift themselves up at the expense of other people. And so what James explained here was, he said, you lust and you have not, you desire to have and you can't obtain it, you fight and you have not. And then verse 3, James explains that any dissatisfaction a person has in life is not an indictment against God, because he says, you ask and receive not because you ask amiss. And so we know that God is willing to give people what they need. And if you have dissatisfaction, it's not God's fault. And if I have dissatisfaction, it's not other people's fault. The fault, if we're discontent, has to come back and lie squarely on our own shoulders. We can't blame other people for our internal discontentment. And some of the reason people don't get what they seek is their motives are wrong. And their arguments, here in James says their arguments were quite simply a product of their lusts or their desires. Personal worldly desires that are in view, and those desires were drawing the believers away from the Lord. And one of my favorite quotes is, I honestly forget who to even attribute it to, but I remember the quote itself, and it's like, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over, expecting a different result. People, and we see people in life all the time, they're stuck in a situation, they're stuck in a circumstance, they want it to change, but they're doing the same thing they've always done for the last 20, 30 years, so it's not going to happen. You can't do the same thing, we can't do the same thing over and over, expecting a different outcome or a different result. It's just not going to happen that way. And so, the question some people might ask is, well, how do we know if our desires are proper or improper? And to me, the answer to that question requires us to perform an honest evaluation of why we want something. What is our motive of wanting it? And that probably, our motive is going to give us a little insight as to if it's something we should be desiring or not. If we want something and we're seeking something because we think it's going to bring a fulfillment to our life, then part of our motive is wrong, because we shouldn't be looking to people or things to fulfill us when only the Lord can. But if we seek anything, even if it's something good or noble, if we're seeking it to replace or to enhance our relationship with God, then we probably have something wrong in our motivation there. And so we can enjoy things that exist in the world without becoming worldly. I mean, we've known people in the past that take it to the extreme where they refuse to go to ball games and they wouldn't let their kids go to amusement parks. And I mean, because they couldn't be part of the world. Well, that's not what this means at all. That's a complete extremist viewpoint that is not biblically related. But we can enjoy things that exist in the world and not become worldly. Again, improper motivation focuses on personal satisfaction and fulfillment rather than God. And proper motivation focuses, to me, on the great commandments. Proper motivation would be, do we want this to help us love God and to help us love others? If we want a new car just because we want our neighbors to think, woohoo, they've made it, that's not really proper motivation. But if we need a good car because we need to bring people to church, or we're ministering and we need reliable transportation, that's a whole other motivation and a good reason for asking for it. So proper motivation is the key. Seeking good things in an attempt just to bring a greater meaning or a greater purpose to our lives is somewhat misguided. Because when it comes down to it, people are never going to satisfy, and things, no matter how good and how wonderful the things are never going to satisfy. It comes down to only a relationship with Jesus Christ. Only God can bring true satisfaction to lives. I don't know about you, but I know people who on the outside are truly good people. They're trying to, seek purpose. They're trying to help the homeless. They're trying to do all these things that are good, but they've never accepted Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. And so they're still trying to struggle to find, they're doing all the right stuff, but they're still not satisfied because that part is still missing. Any thoughts or comments from anyone? So it's always important to understand the root cause. Let's read a few more verses. Verses 4 through 6 talk about being aware of consequences. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whosoever therefore will be a friend of the world is an enemy of God. Do you think that the scripture says in vain, the spirit that dwelleth in us lusteth to envy? But he giveth more grace. Wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace to the humble. So, verse 4, James is strongly condemning worldliness. He's referring to those who loved the things of the world as adulterers. And we know this isn't the first time to use that terminology in resulting to God's people. All throughout the Old Testament, spiritual adultery was exposed among the Jewish nation by the prophets. If you want to do any studying and reading on your own time, you can study Deuteronomy 31. You can read Jeremiah chapter 3. And to me, the definition of spiritual adultery is when you're attempting to say you're in a committed relationship with God, but you're seeking personal satisfaction through the things of the world instead. And James makes it very clear that we cannot serve two masters. And the spiritual adultery that James described is capable of making a person an enemy of God when they're expressing hatred towards God. James's words here reveal what can be a very serious situation. In other words, a person cannot claim to be a Christian and then openly living a double life. And the person, any of us, people, are going to find contentment in a relationship with God or demonstrate dissatisfaction with God and seek fulfillment in other places. There is no true double life living. And we've seen that in the news this past week, how people that have been living double lives, all of a sudden the light has been shined and they've been caught, and now they're having to deal with all the aftermath of that. And so, spiritual adultery, pretending to be in a committed relationship with God but seeking satisfaction elsewhere. So, the question might come up, well, what's so wrong with attempting to serve God but also seeking satisfaction from family or your status in society or material objects? And The reason a person can't seek fulfillment through both God and worldly pleasures is not rooted in our ability to somehow remain focused on God while enjoying these worldly things. Even if we could accomplish that balancing act in the natural, it would not be righteous. And James declares it would be impossible simply because God would not allow it. God does not like a divided heart. He wants a total commitment. And God will pursue that spiritual adulterer in hopes that he or she will return to a full commitment. He will not dwell in them if they choose to pursue other sources of satisfaction, but neither is he going to completely cut them off. And those people who commit themselves to God may not immediately be free from the desire to find satisfaction in other arenas. We know people that have given their lives over to Jesus Christ, and they were so used to their status in the community, they had a really hard time allowing God to take care of that part of their life because they were so used to having that status. That was a hard thing for them not to get comfort or pleasure from. Were they a Christian? Yes, they were as saved as they were ever going to be. But working through that sometimes takes a little bit of time. People that are so used to, their family is their everything. And for them to tone back a little bit on that when they're serving Jesus, sometimes some people have a hard time with that balance. And so it's important that if we're having issue with where we get our satisfaction from, where we get our fulfillment from, that we pray and we ask the Lord to help us, get our fulfillment or our satisfaction from those right things. And James, we read in verse 6, where James explained that God will give us the strength to stay committed to him. And that God shows favor to those who are humble and find satisfaction. It says very simply, he giveth more grace. If you need more grace, he's going to give it to you. It's quite simple. We just have to ask. Any thoughts or comments from anyone? Okay, so let's read a few more verses here. So we've talked about controlling our desires. We've talked about being aware of consequences. And excuse me. And now in verses 7 through 10, it's talking about drawing near to God and submitting to God. So let's read verses 7 through 10. It says, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. Cleanse your hands, ye sinners, purify your hearts, ye double-minded. Be afflicted and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to heaviness. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he shall lift you up." So James here provides 7 keys to aligning ourselves with God and finding genuine, godly, personal fulfillment. The first key being to submit ourselves to God. What is submission? Well, to me, submission is simply a willful act of surrender from one person to another. That's all submission is you're willingly surrendering. And as Christians, we choose to submit to God, recognizing his position, his authority, and choosing to live according to His will and His purpose for our lives. The second key being to resist the devil. Our submission to God is not going to stop the devil from seeking to draw us back. And it is our responsibility as a Christian, if need be, to actively resist temptation. And the key to resisting temptation is found in developing a steadfast love for and contentment in our relationship with God. The devil will many times tempt a person in areas of personal weakness, activities, thoughts, or ambition where that person has especially great desires. What's a temptation for you may not be a temptation for me whatsoever. Example would be alcohol. Some people, alcohol is a very real and great temptation for them, whether it's wine, whether it's beer, whether it's more expensive spirits, whatever the case may be, that's a real temptation for them. If they go to a wedding and there's, drinking, it's hard for them. It's a temptation that they have to pray and, have God bring them through. For me, the thought of drinking rotten fruit has no appeal whatsoever, never has, never will. But different things are different temptations to different people, different areas of weakness. And based on what we've done in our lives, Satan can't read your mind, but he can definitely see our past actions and our present actions. And so he knows what someone's weakness is. And he knows what to throw at you and what to throw at me to tempt us. And temptation can at times be subtle, and temptation can at times be aggressive. And in 1 Peter, it talks about the devil is actually depicted as a lion, a roaring lion seeking to devour any that he can. But how many have ever studied nature? Anybody ever studied nature? The point of that lion roaring is to get the prey riled up. It's to get them off their game. It's to kind of get them scared and get them... The lion isn't roaring necessarily before he attacks. The lion's roaring to get that prey running so he has an easy target. And so it's important to resist temptation, and yes, at times, until we learn who we are in Jesus Christ, is it sometimes more difficult to resist temptation than other times? Absolutely. And so it is always easier to resist if we've submitted to God, recognized our relationship with Him is more important than a temporary personal fulfillment sought for possibly wrong purposes. Any thoughts from anybody before I go on?
Well, as we draw closer to God and resist ourselves and lean on to God's grace more and submit ourselves to God more, the devil's he will do everything in his power to work against us. That's when he comes as a roaring lion. And the whole reason for him doing that is to try to create anxiety in our lives. So if we get anxious about things, instead of really standing firm on faith and begin to become anxious and get into anxiety, that's when his plan can come into fulfillment.
Mm-hmm. Anxiety is definitely a strong tactic of his. Anyone else?
I think that's pretty neat. Both your comment, Brother David's comment, the roar of a lion pretty much
Any other comments? So the third key that James mentions here is to draw near to God. So the first was to admit ourselves to God. The second, one of the second keys is to resist the devil. One of the third keys is to draw near to God. How many know that God will never walk away from a believer? God is never going to walk away from you. He's never going to walk away from me. He promised all the way back in Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6, that he would never leave or forsake his people. He also promised it again in Hebrews 13 and 5. So, if a believer has turned wayward, laying aside their relationship with God, God hasn't walked away from them, they've walked away from him. And if a wayward believer simply seeks God, he's immediately there and ready to receive them back into right relationship. I mean, we think of the story of the prodigal son in Luke. That dad was obviously looking for that son to come home because he saw him way off down the road. He was expecting him to come back and he was looking for him. And so that's how it is God is there, he is ready, he is willing as soon as we are willing to turn back to him. And we read in verse 8, draw nigh to God, he will draw nigh to you, and to cleanse our hands. So the fourth key here is to cleanse or to wash our hands. And I have an image, a farmer or a mechanic is working all day long. Dirty hands naturally come with the job. At the end of the day, their hands are just filthy. I remember my grandpa, he was a mechanic, and even with all his special soaps, he would be scrubbing those hands for 20, 25 minutes at the end of the day, trying to get all the dirt and the grime and the muck of his hands clean. And his hands needed a cleansing. And in the same way, kind of life does that to us. Life, we need to wash our hands and get the muck and the mire off. And if people are attempting to find fulfillment through worldly means, that worldliness is going to attach to them, so to speak. And as followers of God, we have to forsake sinful things, surrender to God, even if it's good things that have taken on an improperly high level of significance in our life. It can be a good thing and need to be surrendered to God just as easily as a sin or a bad thing. We try very hard to pray and have a right balance in our life between family and church and work, trying to find, with God's help, that right boundary. But I know people whose boundaries are way, way out of whack. They don't quite have that balance. And so we have to surrender the good things to God just as much as we have to surrender the bad things. And the fifth key is, in verse 8, is to purify our heart. What is the heart? It's the seat of our affections. How many know you can't be double-minded when it comes to loyalties? You can't truly have two lovers. You can't really have equal loyalty to two things at once. Even in the natural, they've come to find out that, multitasking really doesn't work like they thought it did. Because, you're doing a bunch, but you're not doing any one thing really, really well. And so, we can't be double-minded when it comes to our loyalties. God doesn't want to share our affections. We either follow him or we don't. It's impossible to be double-minded and to still please the Lord. It just can't be done. And the sixth key, which we read in verse 9, says, "Be afflicted and mourn and weep." In other words, you have to grieve over your past sins. You have to admit and accept responsibility for that turning away. James indicates that Christians have to recognize that if they were double-minded, that double-minded way impacted their relationship. No one who truly loves God can come to the recognition of how their worldliness affected their relationship with him and not have some degree of sorrow. And if a person is living a double life and they're not experiencing grief over that double life and that sin, then I guarantee you their relationship with God has died away considerably. Because if you're living a double life, at first you're going to feel conviction over it and you're going to feel regret, and God's going to give you that time period to not be double-minded. He's going to give you to forgive and to turn away from that worldliness and that double-mindedness. And then, of course, verse 10 let us know that the final key is to humble ourselves. I dare say that true humility is one of the most difficult concepts for the average human being to deal with, is true humility. And humility is what leads us to submission. How many know that people often feel that they know what is best for them and nobody's going to tell them differently? Even, I know what's best for me. But humility acknowledges that God is wiser than us. Humility demands a genuine trust in God. Humility is willing to listen to outside wisdom, that God has given people. Any thoughts or comments from anyone? So we just talked about submitting to God. The next few verses actually talk about submitting to one another. So let's read verses 11 and 12 here. It says, "Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judges his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and to destroy. Who art thou that judgest another?" So here in these few short verses, James is focused on a conflict within relationships, demonstrating that if as Christians are truly submitting themselves to God, they are not going to put themselves in the place of judgment over others. Submission to God requires that as Christians, we leave the judgment of others to Him. And there's no place for backbiting, there's no place for slander among Christians. And ironically, I've seen people do this, and you probably have too, where all of a sudden they're using scripture to point out the errors to someone else about their life. I don't know if anybody has ever, seen people do that, where they're using the scriptures to point out the errors in some other people's lives, which doing that is actually violating the very essence of the scriptures to begin with. Because when people stand as judge over others, they're basically saying, well, I'm a judge of God's laws, and they believe that they're capable of determining what aspects should be enforced and which aspects should not be enforced. And how many know that the only one who truly has the abilities to enforce the laws of God is God himself? And the question might come down, well, what is the role of a believer if they see a brother or sister fall into a sinful activity? We as Christians are called to restore, not to condemn. Now, if a person refuses to be restored, you have to make a practical decision regarding fellowship and how much you're willing to hang out with that person. And if a person refuses to be restored, then at times it does call for a separation from that rebellious individual. But it's never our place as a Christian to condemn and judge those caught in sin. It's to us to offer a restoration lifeline through Jesus Christ. Because how many know even Jesus himself said that he didn't come to the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved? The world is already condemned. People are already judged. They don't need us condemning and judging them on top of it. I guarantee you, if somebody's doing something that's wrong, they know it. You know, they don't need us to be negative and in their face with it. They need us to extend God's grace and God's love and God's mercy, not trying to appoint ourselves judge, jury, and executioner over their lives. And so those who find fulfillment in God, we will truly seek to build, to restore others, and leave the judgment to God. Does that mean that we say everything's okay? No, it's not. We still have to have a standard, but we can preach against a sin, against a bad action, without attacking an individual. It's that simple. Any thoughts or comments from anyone? So if we're controlling our desires, we're submitting and drawing near to God, it's important that we're also pursuing God's will. And verses 13 and 14 tell us, "Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is a vapor that appeareth a little time and then vanisheth away." You know, Christians' plans for the future can differ from those of unbelievers. Unbelievers think that they truly control their lives. At least a lot of unbelievers I've met think that they really do think they're in control of their life. And they don't consider any spiritual implication at all when making their decisions. Now, lest that come across wrong, obviously making plans is not wrong in and of itself at all. You know, but God has to be central in whatever plans that we're making. And what James had in view here in these few verses I just read was people planning their lives with no thought of God in those plans. And James 4:14 that we just read, you know, what is your life? It's a vapor, appears for a little time and then vanishes away. That truly is what life is. And no one of us in this room, no one at all, truly is in full control of his or her life. You know, we can guess what's going to happen, and we can try to plan, and we can be responsible as we should be. But a stock market crash can wipe out 50 years of good planning. A car accident, you can be eating all the right things, exercising, being healthy, and then still get a disease. You know, we can do all the right things and try to plan, but ultimately none of us are truly in control of our life here on earth. And only God knows what tomorrow truly holds for each of us. And so if we try to make a decision without consulting him, we're probably not being very smart. In fact, I dare say we're being foolish if we try to plan our lives without consulting the Lord at all. And life is brief. Life truly is brief. And only when we understand our insignificance and embrace the significance of God and whom he is, can we understand our own life better. Because when we realize that, oh, we're insignificant, and how short life really is, and how great God is, and how significant he is, then we're going to have a much better life going forward. Does that mean we never have problems? No, Christians have just as many problems, sometimes seems like more than others. But at the same time, knowing who God is and the significance of him in our life will help us deal with things. Any thoughts from anyone? So closing up here, we're going to read the last few verses of chapter 4, starting in verse 15. For that you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now you rejoice in your boasting. All such rejoicing is evil. Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. So we have here, closing from James, for Christians to put the principles of godly planning into practice. As Christians, we should approach every decision that we are trying to make with consideration to God's will and God's purpose. And that doesn't just mean the big decisions of who we marry, where are we going to work. Christians, we need to consult God when it comes to planning or making a large purchase. We need to consult God with retirement strategies. Every part of our life, from beginning to end, that we deal with on a daily basis, we need to put the principles of godly planning into practice. We do well when we seek God over every relationship. And it's not enough to just make a decision based on what our checkbook balance says we have or not. It's not enough if we think we're wise. God may have a completely different purpose or different plan in mind than we do. And yes, I think it's very irresponsible not to plan ahead for the future to some degree. But at the same time with that, as Christians, we can't hold on to that plan so tightly that when God asks us to make an adjustment, that we don't. And we have to be willing to make adjustments to plans for the future if God says adjust it. And according to James, we read where James said it's evil to live in a way that does not make God's will the primary factor. That type of path is considered worldly, and living a life that does not ultimately recognize the supremacy of God is sinful. James rebuked his readers regarding pride over all their personal successes. They had forgotten to recognize, or perhaps they had even forgotten to seek, God's central role. And proper perspective of who God is key to our lives. And once Christians recognize that we fully submit to God and we find contentment in Him, we have choices to make. We have to ask ourselves, are we going to continue to make worldly decisions that bring temporary pleasure to our lives, or are we going to find satisfaction in God? Living a worldly life rather than a godly life could be considered one of the definitions of being sinful. And the capstone here of all this teaching from James that we read, the capstone of this teaching on worldliness reminds us that sin is not only about what we do, it's also about what we don't do. And it involves what we choose not to do. If we fail to walk humbly, if we fail to practice and show love towards others, if we fail to draw closer or nearer to God, those things are just as guilty, according to James, as what we consider the vile sins of adultery and murder and all those things. So it's a potent reminder that we have to make an active decision on a daily basis that we're going to follow Him or not. Any thoughts from anyone before I close? So, in closing, to me it's imperative that all of us spend time this week asking God to reveal to us if we have too worldly of a lifestyle. And after we do that personal evaluation with the Lord, commit to make a choice. Resolve, that we're no longer seeking excuses, choosing to follow a godly life and find true commitment in knowing that we're living according to His will. Also contemplating if we're committing sins of omission. What good might God be calling us to do? And it's not that we're doing anything wrong, but what are we not doing that we may need to start? And so, by putting Jesus Christ first in our lives, we can experience the joy of overcoming worldliness and showing God's love to the world around us. Any closing thoughts or comments from anyone? And our lesson next week is the last lesson in this book, and it's about cultivating a right attitude, finishing up in James chapter 5. Thank you.